Welcome back to Mildly Interesting and Sleepy. If you have been here before, you already know how this works. The lights are low. The night is doing its thing outside. Whatever needed doing today either got done or it did not, and for the next little while, we are going to let it all rest. If this is your first time here, then welcome, and you have found exactly the right kind of place. This is a corner of the night for stories that go slowly, that have no urgency attached to them, that drift rather than drive. Tonight we are going into one of the oldest stories in the world. One of the oldest stories we know of, at any rate. A story that was being told out loud, around fires, in great halls and outdoor theaters, for generations before anyone wrote it down. A story about a man trying to get home, which sounds simple, but is not simple at all, because the man is complicated, and the way home is very long, and the gods have opinions about how it should go. We're going into the Odyssey. This is Homer's poem, or the poem that travels under Homer's name, since no one is entirely sure whether Homer was a single person, or a tradition of singers, or something in between. A name attached to the greatest work in a long tradition, the way a river's name attaches to a whole watershed. It does not matter very much for our purposes tonight. What matters is the poem, which has been moving through human culture for roughly 3,000 years without stopping, which is the kind of fact that deserves a moment of quiet recognition. 3,000 years. Empires have risen and collapsed in that span. Languages have been born, flourished, and died. Cities that were young when the Odyssey was first sung have been rubble for 1,000 years, and then excavated and turned into archaeological parks where tourists buy small ceramic amphorae in gift shops. And this story has kept going, kept being translated and adapted and argued over and painted and filmed and referenced in ways that the poem's original audiences could not have imagined. You do not need to have read it before. You do not need to remember all the names, and there are many names, because this is ancient Greek literature, and every island has a king, and every king has a complicated genealogy, and every god has a personal agenda. What I want to give you tonight is the feeling of this story, its strangeness, its warmth, its particular combination of grandeur and domesticity. Because one of the things the Odyssey is about, underneath all the monsters and gods and magic, is home. What it means to want to get somewhere. What it costs to want something for a very long time. Find a comfortable position. Let the night settle in around you. We are heading out to sea, to the wine-dark sea, which is how Homer describes it, and we are going to follow a man named Odysseus for a very long journey. He will not always make the best decisions. He is stubborn and clever, and sometimes reckless, and occasionally dishonest, and extremely human, which is part of why the story has lasted. Let us begin at the beginning, which is actually the middle, because the Odyssey is structured in a way that drops us into the story 10 years after the war that started everything. What came before? The shadow of Troy. To understand why Odysseus is at sea, we need to know a little bit about what happened at Troy, which is the subject of Homer's other great poem, the Iliad, and which forms the backdrop for everything in the Odyssey, the way a long, difficult childhood forms the backdrop for everything a person does in adulthood. Troy was a city on the northwestern coast of what is now Turkey. It was a real place, which was disputed for centuries by scholars who thought it was myth, and then confirmed by archaeology in the 19th century when Heinrich Schliemann dug at Hisarlik and found not one Troy but many, a whole stack of cities built one atop the ruins of the previous, the Troy of the Homeric legends probably corresponding to what archaeologists call Troy Vir, a fortified city destroyed by violence around 1180 before the Common Era. A Greek king named Agamemnon assembled a coalition of Greek kings and heroes and sailed there, because a Trojan prince named Paris had taken the wife of Agamemnon's brother Menelaus. Her name was Helen, and she was said to be the most beautiful woman in the world, though the details of whether she went willingly or was taken by force or was somewhere complicated and ambiguous between the two are things the ancient sources disagree about and that modern scholars and writers have been arguing about ever since. The Greeks besieged Troy for 10 years. 10 years is a very long time to be away from home, and that duration, that enormous stretch of time separated from ordinary life, is the context in which everything else in the Odyssey has to be understood. A man who has been gone 10 years is not the same man who left. His household is not the same household he left. His son was a baby. His wife has been managing alone. The world has had 10 years to become something else. Odysseus was the king of Ithaca, a small rocky island on the western coast of Greece. He had a wife named Penelope and a son named Telemachus, who was an infant when Odysseus left for Troy. He was not the strongest Greek hero or the most celebrated warrior, those honors belonging to Achilles, who is the center of the Iliad, a man of such furious brilliance and tragic pride that he makes everyone around him smaller by comparison. Odysseus was something else. He was the cleverest. He was the one who, when brute force was not working, could think of something. It was Odysseus who devised the stratagem of the Trojan horse, the great hollow wooden horse that the Greeks pretended to leave as a gift and offering, filled inside with armed soldiers who crept out at night and opened the gates of Troy from within. The city fell. The war was over. After 10 years of walls that could not be breached by force, they were breached by a story, by a piece of theater, by Odysseus's understanding of how people could be made to want to believe something. And then the Greeks went home, or tried to. Many of them did not make it. Agamemnon made it home to Mycenae and was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover in his own bathtub, which says something about the risks of extended absence. Ajax died at sea, striking the rocks in a storm Poseidon sent. Others found their kingdoms transformed beyond recognition by their long absence, kingdoms infiltrated by new men, wives and children gone strange. The gods, particularly Poseidon the sea god, were angry with the Greeks for various reasons having to do with behavior during the sack of Troy, specifically a sacrilege committed against Athena's temple by a warrior named Ajax the Lesser, and the homeward voyages were difficult and deadly. Odysseus's was the most difficult of all. It would take him 10 more years to get home. By the time the Odyssey opens, he has been away from Ithaca for 20 years, and his wife and son have not heard from him in a very long time, and most people have begun to assume he is dead. He is not dead, but he wishes sometimes that he were home. Where we begin, Telemachus, the boy who grew up without his father. The Odyssey does not begin with Odysseus, it begins with his son. Telemachus is approximately 20 years old at the poem's opening, which in the ancient world was already the age at which a man was expected to have demonstrated something of himself. He grew up without his father and has grown into a young man who is not sure what kind of man he is, which is one of the most common and most painful conditions in human existence. He lives in the palace on Ithaca, which has been overrun for years by suitors. Men from the surrounding islands and nobility of Ithaca itself who have moved in, uninvited, and are eating and drinking their way through the household's resources with the focused determination of people who have decided their desires take priority over anyone else's convenience. Their stated purpose is to court Penelope, Odysseus's wife, who they believe is a widow, and who they are pressuring to choose one of them as a new husband. Their actual purpose, it becomes clear fairly quickly, is to position themselves to take over the kingdom of Ithaca when the question of the throne is settled by Penelope's remarriage. There are more than 100 of them, drawn from the noble families of Ithaca and the surrounding islands of Dulichium and Same and Zacynthus. They slaughter Odysseus's animals, drink his wine, and treat the servants badly, and they have been doing this for years. Penelope has held them off through a famous trick. She told the suitors she would choose among them when she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father Laertes. She wove during the day and unraveled her work at night, and kept this up for 3 years before one of her maids betrayed the secret. Now the pretense is over, the shroud is finished, the suitors are getting restless, and Penelope is running out of ways to delay without either surrendering or provoking violence. Telemachus is furious about the suitors, embarrassed by his own inability to remove them, uncertain of his own authority in his father's house. When the poem opens, he is sitting among them, watching them feast on his inheritance, dreaming of his father's return. He is a young man with no model for what a king should look like, because the king who was supposed to be his model has been gone since before Telemachus could form clear memories. His father's name is famous throughout the Greek world, and that fame is part of the problem. The son of a famous man is always partially in the shadow of what he is not yet. This is one of the quietly sad things about the Odyssey, the way it traces what a long absence does to those left behind. Penelope has been waiting for 20 years. She is no longer young. She has been managing alone through a situation that has no good exit, because the absence of her husband left a power vacuum that the suitors have occupied, and she cannot fill it herself, not because she lacks the intelligence or the will, but because the world of the poem does not give her the structural authority to do so. She is managing within severe constraints, and she is managing brilliantly, but the constraints are real. Telemachus has grown up in a kind of permanent, incomplete state, the son of a famous man he has never really known, defined by an absence. Then a stranger arrives at the palace, a visitor claiming to be an old friend of Odysseus, asking for news and offering some. This stranger is, though Telemachus does not know it, the goddess Athena in disguise. Athena is Odysseus's great patron among the gods, connected to him by a kind of affinity of cleverness, a shared love of the oblique approach and the well-timed deception. She has been watching the situation in Ithaca with something between concern and professional frustration, and she is here to set things in motion. She encourages Telemachus to stand up and assert himself among the suitors, and then to go on a journey to seek news of his father from the kings who served with him at Troy. The journey is partly practical and partly something else. It is an initiation, an education in what it means to be a king's son, to carry a great name, to exist in a world full of older men who remember things Telemachus was too young to see. Athena, disguised first as the old family friend Mens and later as Telemachus's tutor-mentor, guides him gently toward becoming the man the poem needs him to be, without ever quite letting him know he is being guided. Telemachus goes. He sails to Pylos, where the old king Nestor lives, and Nestor tells him stories of the war and of the various difficult homecomings of the Greek heroes, though he knows nothing certain of Odysseus. Nestor is very old and very fond of talking, and his stories are the stories of a man who was there for things that are now the stuff of legend. And there is something particular about sitting with such a person and hearing them speak as though the legendary things were ordinary. He goes to Sparta, where Menelaus and the recovered Helen now live, a domestic scene of strange and particular interest, because Helen, the woman whose abduction started everything, is here in her own home, serving wine to guests, calm and gracious and still beautiful, having returned from Troy years ago with her husband who forgave her or was glad to have her back, or felt some complicated combination of both that he has decided not to examine too carefully. Helen moves through the scene with a kind of perfect self-possession that is either serenity or armor, and the poem does not tell us which. Menelaus tells Telemachus that he heard from the sea god Proteus that Odysseus is alive, but stranded on an island, the captive of a nymph. This is the first definite news the poem gives us about where Odysseus actually is. Meanwhile, back on Ithaca, the suitors plot to ambush Telemachus on his return and kill him, which would remove the last serious obstacle to their takeover. The plot does not succeed, partly because Athena is watching and partly because Telemachus takes a slightly different route. But the plot tells us what we need to know about the suitors. They're not merely rude houseguests overstaying their welcome. They are dangerous men conducting what amounts to a slow coup, and they are willing to commit murder to complete it. The gods' island, Calypso, and the longing for home. The Odyssey cuts away from Telemachus and shows us Odysseus for the first time. He is on an island called Odyssey. He is sitting on a rock by the water, crying. He has been on this island for 7 years. The island belongs to Calypso, a sea nymph of extraordinary beauty, who fell in love with Odysseus when he washed ashore after yet another shipwreck, the only survivor of his last crew. She has kept him here. She feeds him and sleeps with him and will not let him leave. She has offered him something that might sound genuinely appealing: immortality. She has said that if he stays with her, he will never die, will live in this beautiful place forever, ageless, in the company of a goddess. He has refused repeatedly, without wavering. He wants to go home. He sits on the rocks every day looking west toward Ithaca and weeping, and then he goes to bed with Calypso because she is willing and he has no other option, and in the morning he goes back to the rocks. This detail is one of the most carefully observed things in the poem, and it does not get the attention it deserves. Odysseus is being offered immortality and perfect beauty and ease, and he is crying on a rock, homesick. The thing he wants is ordinary and small in the scale of the cosmos: a rocky island, an aging wife, a son he barely knows, a house on a hill, his own particular soil. And that small, ordinary thing is more to him than the extraordinary thing being offered. Homer is saying something here about what human beings are made of, what constitutes a human life, what makes it worth living. It is not the grandest thing available. It is the true thing, the specific thing, the thing that is yours. There is also something quietly honest in the description of the situation on Calypso's island that the poem states without moralizing about. Odysseus sleeps with Calypso at night because she desires it, and he has no power to refuse, and weeps for his wife during the day. The poem does not use the word we might use for this situation. It simply describes it. Calypso has absolute authority over this island, and Odysseus is her captive, and the fact that the captivity is beautiful and the captor is divine does not change the fundamental structure of what it is. The gods, convening on Olympus while Poseidon is temporarily away visiting the Ethiopians, decide to act. Athena makes the case for Odysseus. It is time to send him home. Zeus agrees and sends his messenger Hermes to Odyssey to tell Calypso she must let Odysseus go. Calypso is not pleased. She complains with considerable justice that the gods are allowed their love affairs while goddesses are denied theirs, that there is a double standard in how Olympus treats immortal women who fall for mortal men. She points to specific cases: Eos and Orion, Demeter and Aetion. The male gods took mortal lovers, she says, and that was fine. But when a goddess loves a mortal man, suddenly Zeus has something to say about it. She is not wrong. Her complaint is one of the moments in the poem where a minor character speaks a kind of uncomfortable truth and then steps back and lets the story continue regardless. The world of the gods has its injustices too, and Calypso names them clearly and then releases Odysseus anyway, because she cannot refuse Zeus. She goes to Odysseus and tells him he may leave. He is suspicious. He has been trapped and tricked and betrayed so many times that his first instinct is not to trust a gift from someone who has imprisoned him for 7 years. He makes her swear by the river Styx, the oath that not even gods can break without consequence, that this is not a new deception. She swears, with a faint edge of amusement at his caution. She gives him tools to build a raft. She gives him provisions and instructions for navigation, telling him to keep the constellation of the plough on his left as he sails east, which is practical and specific and correct, and which suggests that Calypso's feelings for him are real enough to include genuine desire for his success, even as she releases him. After 17 days at sea on the raft, he is within sight of the land of the Phaeacians. Then Poseidon, returning from his travels and looking down to see Odysseus finally making progress, is furious. His anger at Odysseus is one of the running threads of the poem, and it has a specific cause we will get to later. He raises a tremendous storm. The raft is destroyed. Odysseus nearly drowns. He is saved by a sea goddess named Ino, who gives him a magical veil that keeps him afloat, and by sheer desperate swimming, and by Athena, who smooths the seas enough for him to find the mouth of a river and drag himself ashore on the island of the Phaeacians. He collapses in a thicket and sleeps. The Phaeacians, a civilization at the edge of the world. The Phaeacians are one of the more interesting elements of the Odyssey, and they are easy to underestimate because they appear in a section that functions primarily as a frame for Odysseus telling his own story. But they deserve a moment. They live on the island of Scheria, which exists at some remove from the ordinary world, a place of extraordinary prosperity and skill, particularly in sailing. Their ships are described as moving without oars or steering, guided by the thoughts of their sailors, knowing by themselves the cities and fertile fields of men. They are, in other words, superhuman sailors in a world where sailing was the crucial technology of civilization. They are also exceptionally civilized in their treatment of strangers, which matters enormously in the Homeric world, where hospitality, the Greek concept of xenia, was a sacred obligation watched over by Zeus himself. The morning after Odysseus arrives, Athena appears to the Phaeacian princess Nausicaa in a dream and suggests, diplomatically, that it might be a good time to go wash the household's laundry at the river. She frames it in terms of Nausicaa's upcoming prospects for marriage. A girl of her standing should keep her linens clean. Nausicaa wakes up and knows the dream is meaningful without quite knowing why, and goes to ask her father for permission and a wagon, and does all of this with a charming mixture of royal dignity and teenage practicality. She takes her maids, and they go to the river and wash the laundry and spread it to dry on the clean pebbles of the shore. Then they eat their picnic lunch and play ball, throwing the ball back and forth while they wait for the cloth to dry, and their shouting wakes the sleeping Odysseus, who is in the thicket nearby. He emerges. He has been at sea for weeks. He has been nearly drowned. He has been sleeping in a bush, and he is naked except for a leafy branch he grabs to cover himself. The girls scatter except for Nausicaa, who stands her ground because Athena has put courage in her heart. Odysseus addresses her from a distance, carefully, speaking to her first as a possible goddess, praising her beauty in comparison to a palm tree he once saw on Delos, and then more practically asking for clothing and directions to the city. The compliment about the palm tree is specifically right. It is admiring without being threatening, grounded in a specific remembered image, more poetic than merely flattering. Nausicaa, who is a practical and generous young woman, gives him clothing and food and directions to the palace. She tells him how to approach her mother, the queen, first, because her father, the king, is affable, but her mother is the one whose judgment matters. She also has the social awareness to tell him not to walk into the city with her, because people will talk, and she is at the age where what people say about her matters to her future. The whole scene has a lightness to it, a quality of two people being very polite and slightly amused at the strangeness of the situation. There is a moment where Nausicaa tells her maids that this stranger does not look like a nobody, and this is her way of saying she finds him interesting. And it is also, coming from a girl of her age and position, very probably true that she is a little dazzled by him. Odysseus arrives at the Phaeacian palace and throws himself at the feet of the Queen Arete, which is the correct formal gesture of supplication. The king Alcinous receives him generously. There is a feast. There is a singer named Demodocus, a blind singer, who performs songs about the Trojan War, and when Demodocus sings about Odysseus and Achilles at Troy, Odysseus weeps, hiding his face in his cloak so no one will see. Alcinous notices the weeping, though he does not yet know who his guest is. He stops the song. He suggests, gently, that they should have games and entertainment, and after that their guest should tell them who he is and how he got here. Games are held. Odysseus, who has been trying to keep a low profile, is goaded by a young Phaeacian man named Euryalus into proving himself, and he throws a discus so far beyond everyone else's throws that it silences the crowd. Then he sits back down and says he is not here to show off, he is here to get home. The games resume. Demodocus sings again, this time a comic song about the affair of Ares and Aphrodite, which is very funny and which lightens the mood. There is more feasting and dancing. Then Alcinous asks his guest again who he is. Odysseus tells them, "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, who am known among men for all manner of wiles, and my fame reaches unto heaven." And then he tells them the story of how he got here. The story within the story, monsters, witches, and the kingdom of the dead. The central books of the Odyssey, roughly the 9th through the 12th, are Odysseus telling his own story at the Phaeacian court. It is one of the great sustained pieces of storytelling in ancient literature, moving through a succession of strange places and impossible situations with a narrative confidence that still works after 3,000 years. These are the episodes that most people know when they say they know the Odyssey, and several of them have become such a deep part of Western culture that they are recognizable even to people who have never read the poem. After leaving Troy, Odysseus and his fleet first raided the city of the Sicons, which was an opportunistic act of violence against an ally of Troy, and which did not go well. The Sicons called for reinforcements, a battle broke out, and Odysseus lost 6 men from each ship. This is the first of many losses, and the poem is quietly clear about the fact that every man who dies is a man with a name and a home he will not return to, not only a number in a tally. Then a great storm blew the fleet off course, past the southern tip of Greece, and north toward the land of the Lotus Eaters. The Lotus Eaters did not attack. They were peaceful. They gave Odysseus's scouts lotus flowers to eat, and the men who ate them forgot about home entirely, forgot about the voyage, forgot that there was anything they wanted except more lotus. They sat in a pleasant haze and did not want to leave. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships by force while they wept and reached back toward the shore. This is a strange and quiet horror, different from the violent threats that come later. Not death, but the erasure of desire, the comfortable forgetting of everything that made one's life meaningful. The lotus does not harm the body. It only removes the reason for going anywhere. Odysseus recognized it as a kind of death and would not allow it. Then came the Cyclopes. The Cyclopes were a race of giants living on an island of extraordinary natural fertility, a place where grapes and wheat grew without cultivation, where the soil was so good it asked nothing of anyone. The Cyclopes took no advantage of this abundance in any civilized way. Each one lived alone in his own cave with his own flock of sheep, with no laws and no community and no ships and no hospitality to strangers. They are the anti-civilization, people who have everything needed for abundance and have organized it into nothing. Odysseus, despite the warnings of his men, wanted to see one, wanted to know what manner of being lived here, and this curiosity, this desire to know things even when knowing them is dangerous, is both his greatest quality and a consistent source of disaster throughout the poem. The Cyclops whose cave they entered was named Polyphemus, and he was the son of Poseidon, which is the key fact about him that Odysseus does not know when he enters. Polyphemus came home, pennied his sheep, built a fire, and found the Greeks in his cave. He ate 2 of them for dinner. He ate 2 more in the morning before leaving again with his flock. He pennied the sheep behind a stone that could not be moved by human strength and left. Odysseus could not simply kill him because the stone door of the cave was too heavy for human men to move, and without the Cyclops, they would be trapped inside until they starved. He needed Polyphemus alive and cooperative, which required making him something he was not, someone who could be cooperated with. The plan Odysseus devised was this. He had noticed a great stake in the cave, which he sharpened and hardened the tip of in the fire. He found the Cyclops' wine, which was very powerful, a gift from a priest of Apollo, and offered it to Polyphemus while engaging him in conversation. The Cyclops, warming to the wine, asked Odysseus his name. Odysseus told him, "Nobody. My name is Nobody." Polyphemus, pleased by the wine and the company, promised as a gift that he would eat Nobody last, and then drank himself to sleep. Odysseus and his men drove the sharpened stake into the Cyclops' eye. Polyphemus screamed, a sound the poem describes as filling the cave and shaking the rocks. His neighboring Cyclopes, hearing the noise, called through the cave wall asking what was wrong, who was hurting him. Polyphemus howled that Nobody was killing him. The other Cyclopes, hearing that Nobody was hurting him, concluded it must be Zeus's will and there was nothing to be done, and went back to sleep. This is the oldest recorded pun in Western literature, and it is genuinely funny, and it saves everyone's life. In the morning, blind and agonized, Polyphemus rolled back the stone door to let his sheep out. Odysseus and his men escaped by clinging to the undersides of the sheep, passing out beneath the Cyclops' searching hands. And then Odysseus made an error. From the safety of the ships, he called back to the blinded Cyclops, taunting him, and when the Cyclops threw rocks in the direction of his voice and nearly swamped the ships, his men begged him to stop, and he could not. He called out his real name, Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes. He could not resist the satisfaction of being known, of having his name attached to the cleverness that had saved them. Polyphemus prayed to his father Poseidon, "Let Odysseus of Ithaca never reach home, or if he must, let him arrive late, alone, on a stranger's ship, to find trouble in his house." Poseidon heard. The prayer was answered, every word of it, and Odysseus paid for one moment of pride with 10 more years of sea. After the Cyclops came Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, who gave Odysseus a bag containing all the unfavorable winds tied up inside it, so that he could sail home freely. They were within sight of Ithaca, close enough to see the fires on shore, when Odysseus fell asleep and his men, convinced the bag contained treasure he was hoarding, opened it. The winds burst out and blew them all the way back to Aeolus, who refused to help again. A man so clearly hated by the gods was not someone Aeolus cared to antagonize. The fleet reached the land of the Laestrygonians, giants who inhabited a harbor with cliff walls so high the ships entered in a confined mass, and the Laestrygonians threw boulders from the cliffs and speared the men in the water like fish. All of Odysseus's ships were destroyed except his own, which had stayed outside the harbor. He sailed away with one ship and the men who remained on it. They came to the island of Circe, a goddess and sorceress, daughter of the sun god Helios and the Oceanid Perse. She was beautiful and lived alone in a palace in a dense wood, and the palace was surrounded by wolves and lions that had once been men she had transformed with her magic. They were enchanted, behaving like dogs, tame and gentle. When the first group of Odysseus's men arrived at her palace, she welcomed them in and gave them food and wine, and then touched them with her wand and turned them into pigs. Only one man, Eurylochus, suspicious enough to stay outside, escaped and ran back to tell Odysseus. Odysseus went to rescue his men. On the way, Hermes appeared and gave him a magical herb called moly, white-flowered with a black root that would protect him from Circe's enchantments. When Circe tried her magic on him and it failed, and Odysseus drew his sword, she fell to her knees and recognized that this must be the man of many schemes that Hermes had told her would come. She released his men and became, over the following year, his lover and host, and something very much like a guide. She knows things, Circe. She knows what is ahead. They stayed with Circe for a year, a full year. His men recovered their strength, and the food was good, and there was wine, and there was nowhere anyone was trying to kill them. It was Odysseus's men who eventually reminded him that they needed to keep going, that Ithaca still existed somewhere, that there was a home to return to. Circe, when he told her they meant to leave, did not try to stop him. She told him instead what they had to do next. They had to go to the underworld. The land of the dead was not a place the living went. It was the final destination, not a stop along the way. But Circe told Odysseus he needed to speak with the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias, who alone among the dead retained his full wits and his prophetic knowledge, and who could tell Odysseus what obstacles lay ahead and how to face them. So Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world, to the land of the Cimmerians where the sun never reaches, and performed the rituals Circe had taught him, digging a pit and pouring in blood, and the shades of the dead came clustering around it, eager, thirsty. Tiresias told him what he needed to know, that Poseidon was furious with him because of the Cyclops, that he would face more trials, and critically, that there would come a moment when they reached the island of the sun god Helios and found his sacred cattle grazing there. Under no circumstances, Tiresias said, must those cattle be harmed. No matter how hungry they were, no matter how long they were stranded, the cattle of Helios must not be touched. If they were touched, Odysseus might still get home, but alone on a stranger's ship to find trouble waiting. Then other ghosts came. His dead comrades from Troy appeared, Agamemnon, who told him what had happened in Mycenae, murdered by his wife, warning Odysseus not to trust too easily when he returned. Achilles appeared, the greatest hero of the age, and Odysseus tried to comfort him with the thought that even in death his fame was extraordinary. Achilles said he would rather be alive as the lowest slave than rule over all the dead. The dead are grey and diminished and long for the sunlit world. Odysseus's dead mother appeared, his mother who had been alive when he left for Troy. She told him she had died of grief and longing for her son. He tried 3 times to embrace her, and each time she slipped through his arms like a shadow, like smoke, like a dream. She told him that is what the dead are. He wept. She told him to go back, to remember everything he had seen, to tell Penelope. He went back. He sailed past the Sirens, those supernatural creatures whose singing was so beautiful that any sailor who heard it was compelled to swim toward them and drown, pulled under by a desire that had no satisfaction this side of death. He had his men stuff their ears with beeswax and tie him to the mast, and told them that no matter how he struggled or commanded them, they were not to untie him until the singing was out of earshot. He heard the Sirens. He wanted desperately to go to them. He strained against the ropes and gestured to his men to release him, and they only tied him tighter, following his own prior orders, and sailed past. The singing faded. They were safe. Then Scylla and Charybdis. Charybdis was a whirlpool that swallowed the whole sea 3 times a day and regurgitated it again, a vortex that would take the entire ship. Scylla was a monster with 6 heads on long necks, each head with 3 rows of teeth, who lived in a cave in the cliff opposite the whirlpool and snatched sailors from passing ships. Circe had told Odysseus the truth he did not want to hear. There was no way through without loss. He had to steer close to Scylla because the whirlpool was total destruction, and Scylla would take 6 men, 1 per head, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. He did not tell his men this. He could not. He watched Scylla take 6 of them, 6 men whose names the poem gives us, and they called out to him as they were carried up into the cave, reaching for him with their hands, and there was nothing he could do. He says in telling the story that this was the most pitiable thing he saw in all his years of travel on the sea, not the monsters or the storms or the dead, his own men calling out to him. Then the island of Helios with the cattle. Odysseus wanted to sail past without stopping. His men were exhausted, and Eurylochus convinced them to land for 1 night and rest. Odysseus extracted an oath from all of them that they would not touch the cattle. The winds pinned them there for a month, and the food they had brought ran out, and they were hungry and desperate. Odysseus went off to pray alone, and while he was gone, Eurylochus persuaded the men that dying at sea was no better than divine punishment, and that at least the cattle were real and present. They killed and ate. When they finally launched, Zeus sent a storm and struck the ship with a thunderbolt. Everyone died except Odysseus, who clung to the mast and was blown back past Scylla and Charybdis, nearly pulled down by the whirlpool, and finally washed up after 9 days at sea on Calypso's island. This is where he had been for 7 years, sitting on the rocks and crying, when the Odyssey picked him up. The homecoming begins, smoke and disguise. The Phaeacians, having heard all of this, are deeply moved. Alcinous says the whole court is moved to pity by what this man has endured, and the gifts they were already planning to give him should be even greater. They load him with bronze and gold and woven cloth, more than he would have brought from Troy had the voyage gone well, and put him on one of their magical ships. He arrives on Ithaca asleep. He has been telling his story for hours through the night, and the relief of having told it, and the relief of being on the ship, and the simple weight of 20 years has put him deeply under. The Phaeacians carry him ashore gently and lay him in a cave with all his treasure around him and sail away. Poseidon, furious that Odysseus has been helped despite his anger, turns the Phaeacian ship to stone as it approaches its home harbor, which is a punishment the Phaeacians accept with the resignation of people who have long known their kindness has a divine price tag. Odysseus wakes up not knowing where he is. Athena has clouded the landscape so he does not recognize it, which sounds unkind, but she has reasons. She appears to him disguised as a young shepherd and tells him where he is. He responds instinctively by telling her a completely full story about who he is and how he got here. He is Odysseus. He has been away for 20 years. He is finally home, and his first instinct, alone on the beach with a stranger, is to lie. Athena drops her disguise and laughs. She says they are alike in this, both of them fond of craft and cunning, and she approves of him even as she sees through him. This is the goddess who invented the Trojan horse with him, she says, in her way. They are the same kind of mind. She tells him the situation, the suitors, Telemachus, what needs to be done. She disguises him as an old beggar, wrinkled and slow and utterly unrecognizable, and sends him to the hut of Eumaeus, his faithful swineherd, who is to be his first point of contact with his old life. Eumaeus is one of the poem's great minor characters. He was born a prince, kidnapped in childhood by Phoenician traders and sold into slavery on Ithaca, where he has served Odysseus's family faithfully for decades. He is now a free man with his own small holding, managing Odysseus's pig herds with the care and attention of someone who has made his work into his dignity. He does not know that the beggar at his door is his master. He welcomes the stranger anyway, feeds him from his own small store, gives him a cloak against the night cold, and speaks with great love and sadness about his absent king. He says he does not speak Odysseus's name in front of strangers anymore. The grief is too fresh, even after 20 years, the loss too much a part of daily life to be ventilated casually. He is a portrait of loyalty that is not mere obedience, but something closer to love. Telemachus, returning from Sparta and guided by Athena, comes to Eumaeus's hut before going to the palace. Athena signals Odysseus to reveal himself to his son, and Odysseus steps outside the hut and is transformed briefly back into himself, his beggar's disguise dropped. The scene is one of the most emotionally careful moments in the poem. Telemachus does not believe it at first. A god must have done this, he says. A moment ago you were an old man, and now you look like my father in the stories. Odysseus says simply, I am your father. There is no other Odysseus. I am home. They weep together. The poem says they cried as sharply and as openly as sea eagles when hunters have robbed their nest. It is a specific and wild image, the grief of birds, and it captures something true about the reunion. It is not simply joyful. There is grief in it for the 20 years, for the childhood Telemachus grew up through without this man, for all the danger and loss and waiting. The joy and the grief exist simultaneously, neither cancelling the other. The palace, enduring the suitors. The palace of Ithaca in the suitors' time is a place of sustained, normalized insult. The suitors eat and drink and throw scraps of food at the beggars who come to the door and mock the servants who serve them and discuss among themselves how to divide the kingdom once the question of Penelope has been settled. They have been doing this so long it has become a kind of routine, a daily life organized around someone else's disaster. Odysseus, as the beggar, arrives at his own palace and is immediately insulted. He is hit with a footstool by one of the suitors named Antinous, the most arrogant of them, who objects to the beggar's presence and his willingness to ask for food. Odysseus endures it. He asks the other suitors to note what Antinous has done, and they mostly agree, muttering among themselves that he has gone too far, not because they are just men, but because they are superstitious enough to know that beggars under Zeus's protection are not safely struck. He is recognized by his old dog, Argos. Argos has been lying on a dung heap outside the palace for 20 years, old and neglected, because with his master gone, there was no one to care for him properly, and the servants have enough to manage without a dog. When Odysseus approaches in his disguise, Argos raises his head and wags his tail, the only creature in Ithaca who knows his master through the disguise, through the years, through everything. Then Argos dies. He waited 20 years to see his master once, and having seen him, let go. This is one of those passages that has broken readers' hearts for 3,000 years without any diminishment. The dog does nothing in the plot. The dog just dies, having waited and then seen. Penelope receives the beggar because she receives all travelers who might have news of her husband. She is not a woman who can afford to be incurious about strangers. In this interview, conducted with elaborate care on both sides, the poem reaches its most emotionally complex territory. Penelope speaks to this dirty old beggar with a kind of weary dignity, asking about her husband, and the beggar feeds her false information mixed with real emotion, constructing a lie that is structured around true things. He claims to have met Odysseus in Crete long ago. He describes Odysseus's appearance so accurately, the brooch he wore, the color of his mantle, that Penelope begins to cry. He tells her Odysseus is on his way home, that he heard this from reliable sources. Penelope says she does not believe that anymore. She has believed too many strangers with too many reliable sources. She has been doing this for 20 years and each time has come to nothing. She is not bitter, exactly. She is exhausted by hope. She has learned to live without it, and she is not sure she wants it back, because wanting it means risking having it taken again. Her old nurse Euryclea washes the beggar's feet, as is custom for honored guests. While washing his feet, she feels a scar on his thigh, a scar she knows, a scar she was present for when he got it as a young man from a boar's tusk during a hunting trip. She knows the scar. She looks up at his face. She recognizes him. She gasps, and Odysseus grips her throat gently and tells her to say nothing. Euryclea, her eyes full of tears, keeps the secret. She has waited longer than almost anyone. The great bow, violence and recognition. The day of the contest arrives. Penelope brings out the bow from the storeroom where it has been kept since Odysseus left. It is a great bow, given to Odysseus years before the war by a famous archer, and it requires extraordinary strength even to string, let alone to draw. She announces to the suitors that she will marry whichever of them can string the bow and shoot an arrow through the rings of 12 axes lined up in a row, a feat Odysseus had apparently been able to do with ease. The suitors take turns. They fail. They warm the wood by the fire to make it more supple. They rub it with fat. They try again. The strongest men in the room, men who consider themselves warriors and athletes, cannot string it. The bow defeats them one by one, and there is something satisfying and slightly comic about this, about Odysseus's identity being maintained by his bow through all the years of his absence, the bow waiting for its master's return. Odysseus has quietly revealed himself to two more loyal servants, Eumaeus the swineherd and Philoetius the cowherd. He showed them his scar. They wept and wanted to embrace him immediately, and he was firm. There would be time for that later. Right now they had work to do. Philoetius would lock the palace gates so no one could escape or send for help. Eumaeus would bring the bow to Odysseus when the right moment came. The beggar speaks up mildly and says he would like to try the bow. The suitors laugh and mock. One says the old beggar has delusions about his abilities. Another worries, sarcastically, that if he strings it, he will want to take one of their women. Telemachus intervenes with an authority he has been growing into over the course of the poem and says the beggar may try if he wishes, because the bow is Telemachus's to give permission for, and the suitors do not actually own anything in this house. The suitors are briefly silenced. Odysseus takes the bow. He turns it in his hands, examining it with the care of a craftsman checking a piece of work that has been stored for a long time, running his fingers along the wood looking for cracks or warping from the years. The suitors watch and jeer, and the poem captures the quality of their laughter, which has the edge of men who are anxious without knowing why. Then, without apparent effort, as easily as a musician strings a lyre, he strings it. He plucks the string. It sings. The sound is compared to a swallow's note, bright and piercing. He shoots the arrow through all 12 axe shafts. He looks at Telemachus. Telemachus puts on his armor. Athena, invisible in the hall, appears briefly as herself above the battle. What follows is the bloodiest part of the Odyssey, the part that readers in every era have debated in terms of its justice and its proportionality. Odysseus throws off his beggar's rags and stands revealed in his own palace. He and Telemachus and Eumaeus and Philoetius kill all the suitors. The doors are locked. There is nowhere to go. The suitors look for weapons and find their armor gone, Telemachus having removed it from the walls the night before at Odysseus's instruction. Several try to negotiate, claim they were innocent, offer to repay everything many times over. Odysseus is not moved. The poem is honest about the fact that some of them were less guilty than others and that they die anyway, and it is honest about the violence of the slaughter itself. After the slaughter, the palace is cleaned. The disloyal servants are dealt with. Brimstone is burned for purification, the sharp, acrid smell of it cutting through the smell of blood. The loyal servants are called in. Eurycleia, who has kept the secret all night, goes to fetch Penelope. The recognition: 2 minds and 1 bed. Penelope comes down. She sits across the hearth from the man who says he is her husband, returned after 20 years, and she does not recognize him, or will not. The distinction matters, and the poem holds it open deliberately and wisely. Telemachus is frustrated by his mother's caution. He says she has a heart harder than stone, sitting there and not embracing her husband who has come home after 20 years of suffering. Penelope says calmly that if this man is truly Odysseus, they have ways of knowing each other that others do not share, and she will know when the time is right. Odysseus nods and tells his son not to press her. He understands. He has understood for much of his life that the direct approach is not always the best one. Penelope tests him. She tells the servants to move the great bed out of the bedchamber and make up a bed in the outer room for their master. This is the test. Odysseus reacts with sudden heat, the only moment in the palace scenes where his careful endurance breaks. He says that is impossible, and the word impossible is chosen. He says he knows the bed cannot be moved because he built it himself, built the bedchamber around the living trunk of an olive tree, an immovable thing rooted in the earth. 1 bedpost is that trunk, still rooted, still living. He trimmed the trunk and shaped the wood himself. He built the frame and decorated it himself. The bed is fixed in place. Unless, he says, his voice dropping, someone has cut through the trunk. Has someone done that? Penelope's knees give way. She crosses the room. She weeps and takes his hands and says she has been afraid, always afraid, afraid of being deceived as she has been afraid of everything for 20 years, and that now she knows that this knowledge is in her bones and her blood and her hands, because no one else knew the secret of the bed. No one. Not even the servants who built the room around it. It was their secret. They hold each other. The poem does not describe what this looks like or how long it lasts. It simply says they wept. Then Athena holds back the dawn. She lengthens the night, pushing the morning back, giving them more time. And they sleep in the bed that is rooted in the living tree, in their house, in their marriage. And then they wake in the long-held night and they talk. The olive tree and what it means. The olive tree at the center of the marriage bed is not a casual detail. The olive is the tree most associated with Athena, Odysseus's divine patron. It is a tree of extraordinary longevity. Some olive trees in the Mediterranean basin are over 2,000 years old, still producing fruit, and the one in Ithaca that Odysseus built his bed around was presumably already old and strong when he incorporated it. It is a tree that cannot be hurried, that cannot be uprooted without great effort and loss, that produces its oil and its fruit on its own timescale regardless of what the seasons around it are doing. The choice to build a bed, the most intimate domestic object, around a living rooted tree, is the choice to build a marriage around something that will not move, that cannot be moved, that is older than the marriage itself and will presumably outlast it. Odysseus did not cut down the tree and use the wood. He built around it, incorporated it, made it part of the structure rather than making the structure independent of the living world. This is a choice that says something about the kind of person he is and the kind of marriage he wanted. When the secret of the bed is the test, it is exactly the right test. It is not a test of valor or cleverness or physical strength. It is a test of intimate domestic knowledge, knowledge that could only belong to the man who was here, who built the room, who lay in the bed. And it reveals, in the revealing, not just that this man is Odysseus, but that Odysseus is still the man who built the bed around the tree, who made that particular choice, who has not become something else entirely in 20 years of suffering at sea. This is what homecoming requires in the poem, not just arriving, not just defeating the enemies, not just being present. It requires being recognized as continuous with the person who left, and the olive tree is the proof of that continuity. The loose thread, Laertes and the old world. The poem does not end with the reunion. It has one more set of things to do, which reflects something true about how homecomings actually work. You cannot simply slot back into your old life. Things have changed. People have changed. The 20 years left marks everywhere and on everyone. The next morning, Odysseus goes to his old father Laertes, who has been living in grief on his farm outside the city, tending his orchard, wearing rough clothes, deliberately taking on the life of a peasant farmer as an expression of his mourning. He stopped being king when Odysseus left. He has been enduring a kind of living death, tending his vines and his fruit trees with the concentrated attention of a man who has found in physical work the only thing that keeps grief at a manageable level. Odysseus finds his father alone in the orchard, digging around one of his trees, and he stops and watches him for a moment, and the watching costs him. The old man is bent and worn and dressed in patched clothes with a goatskin cap, not like a king, not even like the owner of a prosperous farm, but like a man who has been grieving for 20 years and has stopped caring about appearances. Odysseus tests his father at first, presenting himself as a stranger who once knew Odysseus, asking after him. Laertes' grief at hearing his son's name is so immediate and so overwhelming that Odysseus cannot hold the pretense. He reveals himself. Laertes does not believe it. He asks for proof. Odysseus shows him the scar and names all the trees in the orchard that his father once gave him long ago as a boy learning to farm. Here is the pear tree, he says, and the fig trees, and there the rows of vines. Laertes gave them all to him as a child, a gift of the living world, the inheritance before the inheritance. Laertes knows him. The old man's knees give way, exactly as Penelope's did, and Odysseus catches him. They embrace, and Laertes recovers something in his son's arms, some energy or dignity that the years of grief had leached away. He says he wishes he could have been there for the killing of the suitors. He says this with the regret of an old soldier who was not called to the battle, and it is touching and slightly comic, the old man's wish to have been violent beside his son. The families of the slaughtered suitors have assembled, armed and angry, and they come to Odysseus at Laertes' farm. A brief and chaotic battle begins. Laertes throws a spear and kills the father of Antinous, and the blow rejuvenates him further, the old body remembering what it used to be. Then Athena appears and calls a halt. She has arranged this homecoming, and she will arrange its ending too. She declares a peace. The families, awed and frightened by the divine presence, agree to stand down. Oaths are made. The civil war that could have followed the suitors' deaths does not happen. Odysseus is home. He has been home for exactly 1 day, and the day has been the most violent of his violent life. The poem's structure, time and memory. One of the things that makes the Odyssey feel so strange and modern is the way it handles time. The poem begins in the middle of the story, 10 years after the fall of Troy. It then splits its attention between Ithaca, where Telemachus is growing up and the suitors are eating the household into ruin, and wherever Odysseus is, first on Calypso's island and then on the sea. When it reaches the Phaeacians, it doubles back further. Odysseus, telling his own story, gives us the years between Troy and Ogygia in his own voice. Retrospectively, as memory and narrative rather than as real-time event. This structure means that we experience the Odyssey on at least three temporal levels simultaneously: the present of the poem, which is roughly the last 40 days of the return, the recent past that Odysseus tells to the Phaeacians, and the deep background of Troy and before. The effect is of a man whose present self is saturated with past experience, who cannot fully separate who he is now from everything that has happened to him, who is in some sense still living all of it at once. This is a remarkably sophisticated psychological observation for a poem composed roughly 3,000 years ago. We understand now that trauma works this way, that people who have been through extreme experiences carry those experiences in their present moments, that the past is not simply past. The Odyssey does not use modern psychological language, obviously, but it understands something true about what very long and very difficult experience does to a person. Odysseus is never simply in the present. He is always partly at Troy, partly at sea, partly in the Cyclops' cave, partly watching his men be taken by Scylla, partly clinging to a spar in a divine storm. And yet the poem's direction is emphatically toward home and toward the future. It ends with homecoming, with the restored household, with the reinstatement of legitimate order. It does not pretend that the past goes away, but it insists that the past is not everything, that a person can arrive back from the extremity of experience into the ordinary life they left, can find the marriage still rooted in its olive tree, can sleep in their own bed. Penelope, the patience that is not passive. It would be easy and wrong to read Penelope as simply a faithful wife who waits. She is much more than that, and the poem is much more interested in her inner life and her agency than a casual reading suggests. She manages a household under siege for 20 years. She deflects the suitors using intelligence and invention, the weaving and unraveling story being the most famous example, but not the only one. She controls access to her own person, negotiating every advance without committing to any. She maintains authority over servants and slaves in circumstances that would have destroyed a weaker administrator. She presents herself to the suitors as sympathetic enough to keep them hoping while giving nothing away. She is, in other words, running a kingdom under difficult and dangerous conditions, and doing it with the tools available to her in a world that does not give women structural authority. She is also deeply, genuinely sad. The poem gives her real grief, real longing, real despair at points. She weeps in her room. She prays for death in her worst moments. She is not a statue of patient virtue, but a human being who has been bearing something very heavy for a very long time, and the weight shows in her face and in the quality of her speech, a careful diplomatic warmth that has the slight formality of someone who learned long ago not to show too much. The question of whether she recognizes Odysseus before the contest, or during the interview with the beggar, or only when he reveals the secret of the bed, has been debated by scholars of classical literature for centuries and will probably never be definitively settled. There is a reading of the poem in which Penelope is fully conscious of who the beggar is from the moment of their interview, or at least strongly suspects it, and the announcement of the contest is her deliberate way of engineering the homecoming without having to act prematurely in a dangerous situation. On this reading, Penelope is as much an architect of what happens as Odysseus, maneuvering as carefully and as cleverly as her husband. The poem's deliberate ambiguity about her inner state makes this reading possible without making it certain. And the deliberateness of the ambiguity feels intentional, feels like Homer saying that her inner life is hers. What seems clearest is that Penelope is not a passive figure. She has kept Odysseus's kingdom available for him to return to through 2 decades of improvised governance. The recognition scene with the olive tree bed is not merely Odysseus passing her test. It is Penelope verifying, by means that she controls, that the man before her is genuinely the one she wants. She is the last obstacle between Odysseus and his home, and she is also the home itself. What the monsters are. The monsters of the Odyssey have attracted allegorical readings since antiquity, and the allegorical readings are not wrong, but they can flatten what is also a very real quality in the poem's encounters with the extreme and the strange. Homer's monsters are frightening in a concrete physical way before they are anything else. The Cyclops is a giant who eats people, not symbolically but literally, cracking bones and eating them with curds. The Laestrygonians throw boulders onto ships and spear men in the water like fish. Scylla has 6 heads and 3 rows of teeth in each head. The terror is immediate and bodily and specific. Homer wants you to be afraid, and then he wants you to think about what you are afraid of. The lotus eaters represent the oblivion of pleasant forgetting, the erasure of desire and memory by something that feels good. This is an ancient fear, and it is also a modern one. The Sirens represent the irresistible pull of beautiful, dangerous knowledge, the kind of beauty that draws you to your own destruction. Circe represents the transformation of men into animals by appetite, by eating and drinking without restraint or dignity. Scylla and Charybdis represent the impossible choice, the situation where any decision involves loss, and the only question is what kind. The monsters mark the stages of a journey that is also an interior journey. Odysseus comes home wiser than he left, not in the conventional sense that he has accumulated information, but in the sense that he has been tested by encounters with everything that threatens human life and human identity, and has survived them without losing himself. He has faced the temptation to forget home and refused it. He has faced irresistible beauty and bound himself to the mast rather than succumb to it. He has faced impossible choices and made them, and lived with what the choices cost. He has been to the land of the dead and come back. The journey through the monsters is also the journey through all the ways a self can be lost or ended. Eating the lotus, being turned into a pig by Circe, being eaten by the Cyclops, being pulled under by Charybdis, being enchanted by the Sirens into a drowning death. These are all different ways of not being Odysseus anymore. And at each stage, Odysseus finds a way to remain himself, using cleverness or prior planning or divine assistance or sheer stubborn will. The hero of the Odyssey is not the one who never faces these temptations and threats. It is the one who faces them and keeps going. Hospitality and its violations. One of the central ethical structures of the Homeric world is xenia, the complex of obligations and practices that surround the relationship between host and guest. In a world without inns or a reliable legal system or international law in any enforceable sense, the rules around hospitality were a crucial technology of civilization. If you could not trust that a stranger's hearth would offer you shelter, the whole web of travel and trade and diplomacy became impossible. Zeus himself was the guardian of hospitality in his role as Zeus Xenios, Zeus the protector of strangers, and violations of xenia were among the most serious offenses in the divine ledger. The Odyssey is saturated with hospitality, its proper exercise and its violation. The Phaeacians are exemplary hosts. They take in a stranger, ask no questions before feeding him, listen to his story for hours with full attention, give him gifts that exceed what he lost, and send him home in comfort. Eumaeus the swineherd is an exemplary host despite his poverty and his low status. He gives the beggar everything he has, feeds him from his own small store, offers him his own cloak against the night cold, and defends him against disrespect. The old father Laertes planted his orchard and tended it for decades while his son was away, as though keeping something living and growing was itself a form of faithful hospitality. Against these are set the violations. The Cyclops Polyphemus is the anti-host, the one who inverts all the obligations of hospitality. When Odysseus reminds him of his duty to strangers under Zeus's oversight, Polyphemus says the Cyclopes don't care about Zeus because they are bigger than Zeus and his lightning. He is wrong about the cosmic hierarchy, as events prove, but his contempt for the divine order of hospitality is the spiritual violation that precedes the physical one. He eats the guests. This is the ultimate inversion, the host who feeds on the guest rather than feeding the guest. The suitors represent a sustained and more complex violation. They are guests who became squatters who became occupiers. They have consumed the host's resources for years past any reasonable limit, have threatened the host's family, have plotted murder within the household walls. Their violation is less stark than Polyphemus's, but more socially sophisticated. The violation of people who know the rules and have chosen to disregard them, because they have calculated that the host is too weak or too absent to enforce them. The poem treats their deaths as a restoration of cosmic order, sanctioned by Zeus, even as it acknowledges the horror of the slaughter. 3,000 years of returning, the poem's afterlife. The Odyssey has never stopped. From the moment it was written down in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, it has been in continuous circulation, continuous use, continuous argument. No other work of Western literature has had quite the same combination of constant presence and constant transformation. Virgil wrote the Aeneid partly as a response to both the Iliad and the Odyssey, giving Rome its own epic of wandering and homecoming in the story of Aeneas fleeing Troy and eventually founding the line that would become Rome. Aeneas is a different kind of hero from Odysseus, more dutiful, less individual, defined by his mission rather than his desire to go home, which is perhaps why the Aeneid feels different from the Odyssey in its emotional temperature. But the debt is everywhere, in the storm at the beginning, in the descent to the underworld, in the love affair abandoned, in the arrival at a strange shore. Dante put Odysseus, under his Latin name Ulysses, in hell. He gave him a different ending from Homer's. Dante's Ulysses cannot rest in Ithaca and sails again, past the pillars of Hercules that the ancient world considered the boundary of the known, out into the open Atlantic. He encourages his old crew with a famous speech about the human desire to follow knowledge wherever it leads, and they sail until a storm sent by God drowns them all. This Ulysses is punished for his desire to know beyond what God permits. It is a very medieval reading of a very archaic hero, and it has its own power. Tennyson wrote a very different Ulysses in 1833, an old man refusing to settle into his homecoming, bored by Ithaca and by Penelope and by Telemachus and by the settled life of a king in a small kingdom. He wants to sail again, to see the unknown, to seek and find, and not yield. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, which is the poem's last line and one of the most quoted lines in Victorian English. This Ulysses reads the original quite freely, and it says more about the Victorian ethos of relentless forward movement than it does about Homer, but it has its own vitality and its own truth. James Joyce wrote Ulysses in 1922, mapping the episodes of Homer's poem onto a single day in Dublin in June of 1904. Leopold Bloom is Odysseus, a middle-aged Jewish advertising salesman whose wife Molly is having an affair, and whose wanderings through Dublin encounter versions of the Sirens in a bar, Circe in a brothel, Nausicaa on a beach, the underworld in a cemetery. What Joyce understood is that the Odyssey is not a mythological adventure story, but a story about what an ordinary day in a mortal life contains, which is everything. The parallels are often ironic and often comic, and they reveal that the 10-year voyage of a Greek hero and the single day of a Dublin salesman are made of the same material. Derek Walcott's Homeros, published in 1990, transposes the Homeric world to the Caribbean and to the history of slavery and colonialism, finding in the old story a way to talk about a very different kind of displacement and longing for home. His Achille is a St. Lucian fisherman. His Helen is a beautiful woman who moves between men as the island of St. Lucia has moved between colonial powers. The poem meditates on what it means for a culture to carry the names and stories of another culture's mythology while living with the specific wounds of its own history. It is one of the most ambitious and successful of the Odyssey's many descendants. Margaret Atwood's Penelopead gives the whole story to Penelope and to the 12 maids who were hanged, letting them speak from the underworld with a kind of dark comedy and genuine anger, asking why their deaths have been footnotes in a story that was supposedly about justice and homecoming. It is a useful corrective and also a genuinely moving work, and it asks questions the original does not answer. These are only the literary responses. The Odyssey has also generated a continuous tradition of paintings, sculptures, operas, films. Every story about a long journey home is in some sense in conversation with it. Every character who is clever in a way that might get them into trouble as often as out of it has something of Odysseus in their genealogy. Every story about the person who left and the person who came back not being quite the same person, about the family waiting and what waiting costs them. All of this exists in a lineage that goes back to the poem. What it feels like, the poem's texture. I want to spend a moment on what the Odyssey feels like to read, because its feeling is distinct from its story and its meaning and deserves its own attention. Homer's similes are one of the first things everyone notices, the extended comparisons that pause the narrative to draw an analogy from ordinary life. When the suitors fall before Odysseus's arrows, Homer compares them to fish dragged from the sea and left gasping on the beach, flopping. When Odysseus strings the bow, the string sings like a swallow. When Odysseus and Penelope lie together after the reunion, they are compared to survivors of a shipwreck who finally reach the shore and feel the solid ground. These similes have the effect of connecting the extreme, distant, mythological world of the poem to the world the poem's audiences actually lived in. Fishing, birds, storms, the specific texture of Mediterranean daily life. They say, this strange thing is like a real thing you know. The repetition in the poem, the repeated epithets and repeated scenes, which can seem redundant to modern readers used to prose fiction, served a very specific function in a poem composed for oral performance. The epithets, Odysseus the much-enduring, Dawn with her rosy fingers, the wine-dark sea, were memory aids for the singer and orientation aids for the audience, recurring landmarks in the landscape of the poem. They also have a cumulative effect. By the 100th time you encounter rosy-fingered dawn, the phrase has become a pleasure in itself, a familiar arrival, like the return of a musical theme. They have the quality of things said, so often they have become true in a different way than new words are true. The poem moves between registers with remarkable flexibility. It can be very funny. Odysseus getting Polyphemus drunk and telling him his name is nobody is slapstick comedy at its most efficient. The fight with the beggar Eros, which the suitors arrange for their amusement, is broad comedy that turns suddenly dark when you realize Odysseus is barely restraining himself from killing a man he could kill with one punch. The scene with Nausicaa and the laundry has a lightness that feels almost modern, two people being very polite in a slightly absurd situation. And then it turns, with full commitment, to genuine sorrow. The dog Argos dying, the ghost of Odysseus's mother that he cannot embrace. the 6 men taken by Scylla, whose names the poem pauses to give us. The scene in the underworld where Achilles says he would rather be a slave than rule over all the dead. These are not decorative sorrows. They have the weight of acknowledgement, the poem insisting that the losses are real, that even a story that ends in homecoming contains deaths that do not come back and griefs that do not resolve. The night side of the Odyssey. There is something the Odyssey knows about the night that seems relevant to why we are here, reading it in the dark. The poem is full of sleeplessness and nocturnal waiting. Penelope weeps at night when the household is quiet. Odysseus, on Calypso's island, sleeps with the goddess at night because he has no choice and sits on the rocks crying during the day, and the poem specifies this distinction with quiet precision. There is a difference between what you do in the night when there is no escape from loneliness, and what you do in the day when you can at least sit by the water and look toward where home is. Night is the time of the real. The gods move more freely at night. Athena appears to Nausicaa in a dream. Hermes travels in the hours before dawn. The liturgy of preparation for the final battle, Odysseus telling Telemachus to go to bed while he stays up and thinks through every detail of what will happen in the morning, has a particular quality of nocturnal deliberateness. The long thought that only happens when the day's demands have been set aside, and there is nothing between you and what you know. The poem's oral origins mean it was performed at night in the great hall after the feast, when the fire was burning and the wine was poured and the day's work was done, and people were ready to go somewhere else in their minds. The singer began, and the room went with him to Troy, to the sea, to strange islands, to the kingdom of the dead. They stayed there for hours, and then came back to themselves, to the warm room and the embers and the familiar faces, which all looked a little different for having been temporarily away from them. The night travel of the poem mirrors the night travel of sleep, the way the mind goes somewhere it could not go in daylight and comes back with something it could not have found by looking directly at it. This is what the Odyssey was made to do. It was made for exactly this, the hour when the day is over and you are warm and you can afford to go somewhere in your mind, made to take you out and bring you back, made to give you the feeling of absence and return without requiring you to actually be away from anything. What we carry away. We have been at sea for a long time tonight, in a manner of speaking, following a man who was at sea for much longer in the actual manner of speaking. We have visited the dead and the divine and the monstrous and the ordinary, and we have found, as the Odyssey always finds, that the ordinary was there all along underneath the extremity, waiting to be returned to. The Odyssey is a poem about what we want when we really want something. Not the grandest available thing, not the most beautiful island, or the longest life, or the most glorious achievement. The thing we want is the thing we left. The specific weight of a specific life, the particular light of a particular place, the person who knows the secret of the bed. This is what Odysseus crosses the ocean for, and descends to the underworld for, and endures the Cyclops and the Sirens and the cattle of the sun god for. Not greatness. Home. And yet the poem knows, without saying so directly, that the returned Odysseus is not quite the man who left. He cannot be. The man who left was the father of an infant and the husband of a young woman and the king of a small island who had never seen a goddess or a monster or a kingdom of the dead or the underworld, where his own mother's ghost slipped through his embracing arms like smoke. The man who comes back has been all of those places. He carries all of it inside him. The reunion with Penelope and the olive tree bed is true and real and what he wanted, but it is also a reunion between two people who are both somewhat different from who they were when they parted, and the poem's tenderness for this, the way it lets them lie awake and tell each other everything that happened, is one of its most humane qualities. The story has traveled 3,000 years not because the Greek world was so different from ours that it provides an exotic escape, but because it was not so different in the things that matter. People have always left and tried to come back. The way has always been longer and stranger than expected. Something has always changed while they were gone, in the house or in themselves or in both. The recognition, when it comes, has always been complicated by the years between, and the joy of coming home has always been mixed with the grief of all the time the coming home cost. And someone has always been sitting by the fire, doing the same work over and over, keeping the household together, waiting. Coming home to the night. It is very late now, or early, depending on which side of the dark you are on. We have followed Odysseus from Calypso's island to Ithaca. We have sat in the hall of the Phaeacians and listened to him tell his own story in his own voice. We have watched Telemachus grow from the uncertain young man at the beginning into the one who stands at his father's side when the bow sings. We have been with Penelope in her room, unraveling the work she did during the day, buying time with her hands. We have walked with Odysseus as a beggar in his own house, enduring insults with the patience of a man who knows exactly what he is waiting for. We have been to the underworld and come back. We do that when we follow this poem. We go somewhere very far and very dark, and we come back to ourselves, which is perhaps part of what the poem was always for. I want to leave you with one last image from the poem. It is not one of the famous ones. It is the moment after the recognition, after Penelope has finally understood that the man before her is her husband, after they have wept and held each other, and Eurycleia has prepared the chamber. Athene holds back the dawn to give them more time, and in that extended night, they lie together in the bed that is rooted in the living tree, and they talk. They tell each other everything. Odysseus tells his wanderings, all of them, the full length of what he has been through. Penelope tells the suitors, the years, the waiting, the weaving and unraveling, the 1,000 small negotiations required to keep the house from being destroyed by men who did not care what the house meant. They are equal in this exchange. They give each other the full accounting of what the absence cost and what it meant. No one is only a hero, and no one is only a wife. They are two people who have been through very different versions of the same ordeal, and they are finally in the same room, in the same bed that is rooted in the living tree, in the same dark that Athene has held open for them, telling each other the truth. That seems to me to be what the Odyssey is finally about. Not the monsters, not the cleverness, not even the homecoming, the telling, two people in the dark, after a very long time apart, giving each other the full story. The night around them like a held breath, neither of them anywhere else. Dawn is waiting, has been waiting, Athene's hand on it, and when they finally sleep again, she will let it come. But not yet. Sleep well. Thank you for making this long voyage with me.